All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So first off, I want to welcome all of you to today's webinar on migrating to Hyper-V for VMware administrators. My name is Andy Serwich, and I'm kind of going to be leading you through today's webinar, and we got a lot of great content for you here. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me get my webcam on here so you can see my lovely smiling face. There we go. All right. Move that over here. So, again, hope everyone's having a good day so far. And the first thing that we're going to cover is our agenda for the day. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to get into some introductions. We're going to talk about Hyper-V architecture. You're kind of going to get a bit of a crash course on Hyper-V architecture and the management differences. So that's going to be probably the first half of our talk today. So you kind of have a good baseline of kind of how things look and feel with Hyper-V, especially if you've never used it before. So I'll make sure to highlight some of the major differences between vSphere and Hyper-V as we kind of go through those two sections. That way, you have a better idea of how things work when we get to the second half of the webinar later today. After that, we're going to cover some of the primary tools that are used for migrations to Hyper-V. We've got disk to VHD, the Microsoft Virtual Machine Converter. We're going to talk about Azure Site Recovery, and then we're going to talk about other options. And then finally, we're going to have some Q&A and wrap up at the end of the webinar today. Now, a quick mention on the Q&A. Please hold your questions to the end of the webinar. I mean, feel free to ask them using the question form throughout the webinar, but we won't actually answer any of them until we get to the Q&A section at the end. And what we'll do is we usually set aside 10-15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the webinar. And if for some reason we don't get through all of the questions during that time, I always like to do a follow-up blog post out on the Altaro blog, specifically to answer all those questions that didn't get covered during the webinar. So if you ask a question today and it doesn't get answered, be sure to check on our VMware blog at www.altaro.com/VMware for a follow-up post that contains your question and the associated answer. So again, my name is Andy Serwich, and I'm a technical evangelist with Altaro Software, who's the sponsor of today's webinar. And on top of that, I'm also a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center Management MVP. Used to be the Hyper-V competency, but it's now been fit into this Cloud and Data Center Management competency. So, I've been in the industry for about 14 years now in a number of different capacities. Before my time with Altaro, I worked for internal IT departments. I worked for managed services providers. I've always been focused on infrastructure, virtualization, storage, cloud services, the Microsoft server stack. And I've got Hyper-V plastered all over my bio here, but because we're talking about VMware in this webinar as well, I kind of want to mention that, I've often worked with VMware quite a lot as well. So in this webinar, we're talking about migrating from VMware to Hyper-V, and my career has very much kind of gone in that direction. My first introduction to virtualization was with vSphere. I cut my teeth on ESX 3 and 3.5, so I've definitely been involved in VMware for many, many years. During my time working for an MSP here in the Midwest region in the U.S., I spent basically all of my day supporting a hosted cloud infrastructure that was based on VMware. So very, very familiar with vSphere and very familiar with Hyper-V as well. So I always like to have these talks where we kind of compare and contrast the two and help folks figure out how to move from one to the other. So a little bit of mention here about today's sponsor. Again, my employer, Altaro Software. We're a fast-growing developer of easy-to-use, user-friendly backup software. Pretty awesome software. We're trusted by 30,000 customers and 6,000 partners. And that flagship product of ours is Altaro VM Backup. If you're interested in more information on that product, feel free to go out to altaro.com/VM-backup for more information. So, whenever I have this particular discussion, whenever I'm doing a presentation that involves both Hyper-V and VMware, I always have a slide like this. So let's just set some expectations right from the get-go. So what this presentation is not is, it's not going to be a bashing session. I'm not going to say, you know, oh, Hyper-V is better than VMware or VMware is better than Hyper-V. I always like to take an objective look at both platforms, what their advantages and disadvantages are, what are the differences, and how do you get from one to the other. So in this case, we're talking about going from VMware to Hyper-V. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, Andy, you know, you're a Hyper-V guy, so you must prefer Hyper-V. Well, you know, if I'm honest with myself, yes, I prefer Hyper-V, but I like both solutions. I really do. I like vSphere too. They make a fantastic product. And really at the end of the day, it all comes down to whose ecosystem do you want to be in, right? I mean, both products, they provide all kinds of fantastic solutions for infrastructure, for virtual machines, for storage now too. I mean, you think about vSAN and storage spaces direct on the Hyper-V side. I mean, both solutions they're mature, they're great solutions. And again, like I said, at the end of the day, it just depends whose ecosystem do you really want to be in. So again, like I said, just setting some expectations, not going to bash one solution over the other, just taking an objective look, because a lot of folks are finding themselves in this situation now. They're having to migrate from one to the other for whatever reason. It really helps to have the skill sets with each platform in case you ever find yourself in that type of situation. So like I mentioned earlier, we're going to start with a crash course in Hyper-V. So the first thing we're going to talk about is some architecture. Then we're going to talk briefly about installation, and then we're going to get into the different management tools, because I find one of the places that VMware administrators struggle with the most when it comes to Hyper-V is management of the solution. And you'll find, you know, I'll talk about why here shortly. So first thing, let's talk about Hyper-V architecture. You're going to find that the architecture of Hyper-V is very, very similar to VMware, very similar. So you could have a standalone Hyper-V host, just like you have a standalone ESXi host. Maybe it's a small business, you know, maybe it's a couple person shop. They need a hypervisor and a couple of servers running on it. Hyper-V certainly has the ability to run as a single hypervisor and host some VMs. So you have your single hypervisor, and you've got your VM traffic going out to the network. So that's doable. That's a very common solution, very much like so on the ESXi side. Now, Hyper-V also has the ability to cluster. So let's say that I've got two Hyper-V hosts, and I want to have high availability between the two of them. That way, my virtual machines can tolerate a host failure, just like HA and VMware. And I can do that very much like you do on the vSphere side. So what you have to do is I need some sort of storage that is visible to both Hyper-V hosts, just like you do in vSphere. This could be, you know, a traditional SAN that's presented via iSCSI or Fiber Channel. It could be storage spaces direct, which again is Microsoft's equivalent of vSAN. Could just be an SMB3 file share. The lab that I'm going to show you here in a second, all of my VMs are stored on just an SMB file share on a file server. So lots of different options when it comes to storage, just like the vSphere side. And once you've got that storage presented, you can generate that cluster, and now you can start sending that cluster traffic over a switch, you know, over your switching network. You can start presenting that VM traffic to your end users, and it's very, very similar to the vSphere model. So, you know, I talk to a lot of IT pros that are on the VMware side, and, you know, they kind of think this Hyper-V architecture is kind of a mysterious thing, you know. They assume that it's different, and really, you know, at the most base level, yes, the software is different, but I mean, from a design perspective, you know, it looks very, very much the same. Now let's talk, you know, installation. This is one common area that a lot of people get hung up. If you've worked with licensing in your vSphere environment, this left-hand column here is going to look very similar because you have similar concerns on the vSphere side. So for Windows Edition options, you know, what edition of Windows are you going to use for your Hyper-V hosts? You know, you can choose any edition of Windows. There's a couple of different versions. I'll start with Hyper-V Server. So this is actually a free SKU of Windows Server. It contains just the roles needed for Hyper-V. So that's Hyper-V, that's failover clustering, that's MPIO, and any other core feature that is required for Hyper-V. It runs in Windows Server Core mode, which means you don't have the traditional UI. You have a command line, you've got Task Manager, Notepad, just some other basic system utilities to help you manage that machine locally. As far as managing the hypervisor itself, you have to remotely connect using the RSAT tools, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I always like to highlight that this is probably the most similar to ESXi minus a new option that has come up recently, which I'll talk about here in just a second. The other thing I like to point out with Hyper-V Server is that there is no licensing included with this. So again, it's a free SKU. You go out and download it. If you use it in production, Microsoft assumes that if you're going to run Windows Server VMs on it, you have that licensing already in some other way, shape, or form. So just keep that in mind. If you use Hyper-V Server, your licensing has to come from elsewhere. Standard Edition, you can use Windows Server Standard Edition. It's it's complete Windows Server. You can run it in any mode, full UI, server core, and it allows you to run up to 2 operating system environments. So, that's fancy legal speak for VMs, operating system environments, VMs. So that allows you to run 2 virtual machines, 2 Windows virtual machines on top of that physical Hyper-V host. And then your final version here, Data Center Edition, exactly the same as standard for the most part, minus a couple of storage-related features. The big difference here is instead of just 2 operating system environments, you've got unlimited. So as many VMs as you want. We talk about Windows Server 2016. We've got this new, excuse me, allergy season here in the U.S. You talk about Windows Server 2016, we got this new concept of Hyper-V containers. That question often comes up when I'm talking about this. Hyper-V container counts as an OSE, so keep that in mind. Now, what about operating system options? You heard me talk about Windows Server Core a second ago. There's a couple of different ways that you can install the Hyper-V host. You can choose a full server with a GUI. This is probably best for small installations where, like I mentioned earlier, you've got kind of that mom and pop shop, couple of users, and you want to have the management tools directly on the host. Full server with a GUI is a good option for that because, again, you've got all those tools right there on the host. You don't have to worry about having a management workstation somewhere that's part of that domain. The other option we've got is Server Core. It's really considered to be kind of the best balance between low overhead and allows you to kind of have some management on the host still. You've got PowerShell on the host. You've got some basic tools available on the host itself for management, and it's pretty nice. It's stripped down enough to where you don't have to worry about a ton of reboots for patching, and it's a nice middle ground between that and this new option in Windows Server 2016 called Nano Server. Nano Server is completely headless. You log in and look at the console of a Nano Server host, and you have a menu with maybe 2 options. You can configure some networking and firewall rules, and that's about it. So getting it connected, that's really much, pretty much all you can do on the console itself. Other than that, 100% remote management. Now, it provides the lowest overhead, and it is absolutely the most secure of all the different options here. It follows Microsoft's concept of only installing what is absolutely needed on the host to get the job done. So it's extremely stripped down. It's extremely small. Takes 20 seconds to boot, even less than that in some cases, depending on your storage. And it's pretty darn good for Hyper-V hosts. So if you want maximum amount of resources to go to your VMs, and you want the most secure and the lowest amount of reboots needed for patches, Nano Server is your option. Now, I always like to talk about a couple of common Hyper-V myths. So I'm going to do a little bit of myth busting when it comes to Hyper-V. And I talked to a lot of IT pros that are coming from vSphere over to Hyper-V like I did in my career. And these are some common misconceptions that I run into quite frequently. So the first, you need System Center and Virtual Machine Manager if you want clustering in HA. Now, I get where this misconception comes from. So on the vSphere side, if I want clustering in HA, I need vCenter, right? I mean, that's just the way vSphere works, and it's common knowledge for anyone that's worked with vSphere on a regular basis. And a lot of people on the VMware side, they associate System Center and Virtual Machine Manager, or VMM, or SCVMM for short. They associate that with vCenter, and they assume that it's required for clustering in HA. And that's not a fact. That's a myth. You can get clustering in HA and Hyper-V without SCVMM. When Microsoft started developing this and they started thinking of ways to do clustering in HA, they didn't really need to reinvent the wheel a whole lot because they already had Windows Server failover clustering. So really, when you want a Hyper-V cluster and you want HA capabilities in Hyper-V, you actually install the failover clustering role inside of Windows, and you set up a failover cluster just like you would for any other major Windows service that you want a failover cluster for. Our next common myth is you can't create templates without SCVMM. And as it depends on what your definition of a template is. Now, SCVMM actually defines an image as a template, and you can actually store templates in kind of a library with SCVMM. But you can do it with just a standard Hyper-V host as well. So, for example, if you want to create a gold image with Hyper-V, you create your VM, you get it exactly how you want it, you patch it, you get it all ready to go, you sysprep it, and then you copy that VHD, or you just move that VHD into a storage location, get rid of the virtual machine, and that VHD is essentially your template. So what you do is you embed an answer file into that VHD, and anytime you want to deploy your template, copy that VHD, fashion a new VM out of it. When it boots up, it'll run that answer file, and your machine will be customized just like it was a template. So it is possible without SCVMM, and I always like to point that out as well. Another common myth, Hyper-V isn't as secure as ESXi because it's Windows. And it's been kind of a running joke over the last decade that, oh, hey, Windows isn't as secure, blah, blah, blah. Well, when we're talking about hypervisors and, we're talking about the nano server and the server core options, Hyper-V is very, very secure. It's a very secure hypervisor. The hypervisor itself is quite small. They use the Windows kernel for certain things, but the Windows kernel itself is very secure as well. The problem comes when you're adding on software like web browsers and all the other things that get installed inside of the GUI on the server. So when you're going with the server core and especially the nano server option, you're not running a GUI on the server. You're not running all of these pieces of software that are susceptible to attack. You're running a more lean, streamlined host that is very secure, and really you shouldn't have any concerns when running Hyper-V in that fashion. Physical domain controllers required for clustering. So if anyone that's ever set up failover clustering, domain controller is often a requirement for clustering. There are some cases where you can get by without a domain controller, but for the best results, for the best experience, for the most ease of use, you're going to want a domain controller, a domain present in some way, shape, or form. Now, I don't know where this particular myth come from, but I've run into this a lot of times where people think that, hey, I need a physical DC in my environment in case, one of the hosts, falls over and dies. I would have said back in the 2008 R2 Hyper-V days, I would have wanted a physical DC around. But since 2012 R2 and now 2016, there's enough logic built into clustering and Hyper-V itself to where you can virtualize your domain controllers on top of your hypervisors. You can set up anti-affinity rules to make sure that those DCs are on separate hosts at all time. That way, if you do have a host failure, AD is still present somewhere else in the cluster. and you're good to go. So a physical DC is not a requirement for clustering. And I always like to point that one out as well. And I think our final one here is Hyper-V does not scale as high as VMware. I used to not talk about this particular bullet point in these conversations, but there's always that one guy that wants to wants to talk about it. To me, this is kind of a moot point. I mean, both solutions, they scale ridiculously high that only, the Googles and the Amazons and the large enterprise of the world would ever potentially hit that number. And we'll see some of those numbers here in just a second. So I mentioned those numbers, and here they are. So, I mean, these are 2016 Hyper-V numbers. I mean, 2016 Hyper-V, I mean, you can assign 240 vCPUs per VM, 12 terabytes of memory per VM. The virtual disk capacity in Hyper-V is 64 terabytes. You can run over 1,000 VMs on a physical host. You can do 64 physical nodes per failover cluster. I mean, it's just astronomical. I mean, most businesses are not even in a place where they could even dream about hitting these maximums. And that's why I say it's kind of a moot point. It doesn't really matter. If I was talking about VMware right now, I'd be putting up similar numbers and I'd be saying the same thing. It just doesn't really matter. I mean, it's going to be able to handle your use case, and really that's the important thing, right? So, managing Hyper-V. So, it's a bit different than vSphere, and this is where things start to differ a little bit. So, and I will say that this is one area where I probably like vSphere a little bit better, because vSphere kind of has that all-in-one management tool in vCenter, right? It's kind of your one-stop shop for managing everything there is to do with the solution, whereas with Microsoft, they're using a lot of their existing tool sets, and you kind of have to jump around a bit based on your particular environment and your use case. So we have up to 4 potential management interfaces. First is Hyper-V Manager, which is what you see on the screen here. And this is probably what most people are most familiar with. Hyper-V Manager is great for small 1 to 2 host setups where clustering is not in the picture. And then we have Failover Clustering Manager, which you'll see here shortly. A lot of people don't know this. You can actually use Failover Cluster Manager to manage Hyper-V. So that's designed to be used when you've got a small cluster in play, small to medium-sized clusters, I would say. And it's great for that use case, and I'll show you here shortly. SCVMM is really intended for large enterprise clusters. So again, I kind of mentioned a lot of people make the correlation that, vCenter and SCVMM are kind of the same thing, different platforms. That's not really the case. SCVMM, you really only need it when you have massive deployments. A lot of people ask me the question, well, how many hosts? How many hosts should I have before I start thinking about SCVMM? And over the years, my number has steadily increased. I've gone from 10 to 20. Now I'm saying if you've got 40 hosts or more, then maybe it's time to start worrying about SCVMM. But you can do a lot with the other 3 management utilities without requiring SCVMM. PowerShell is there for all your automation workloads as well. Anything that you can do in the GUI, you can do in PowerShell and then some. There are some functions that are PowerShell only, but it's great for automation and scripting. So I wanted to show the management utilities real quick. So I'm going to pop over into this lab here. So I've got a lab that is running a couple of different Hyper-V hosts. So this first host that I'm looking at is just a standalone host. It's this Ando MB HV3 standalone host in this lab, and it's just running a single VM right now. So it's not doing anything fancy. Now, the first time you install a host, there's a couple of different things that you need to do. You need to come in here to Hyper-V Manager. You need to, add it into Hyper-V Manager. Again, Hyper-V Manager is just an MMC snap-in, very similar to a lot of the other management tools on the Hyper-V side. And you got a number of different things that you can do here. Hyper-V settings is probably, excuse me, Hyper-V settings is probably the first area that you're going to want to go into, because here you control a lot of the, behaviors of the hypervisor itself. You know, you get to specify, okay, where am I storing my virtual machines? You know, so here are the virtual hard disks. Again, you can, you know, I mentioned earlier, I'm using an SMB share to actually store my VMs. Virtual machines is kind of where the supporting files for the virtual machine get stored. I can configure NUMA. I can configure live migration, aka vMotion. Live migration is Microsoft's version of vMotion, so you can configure that here. This is where you can actually define what IP addresses to use for live migration. Now, this is a standalone host. So people often ask, well, why is live migration here for a standalone host? Well, Microsoft has the ability to do live migrations from standalone hosts to other standalone hosts, just like vSphere does. So, and you can control that behavior here. Storage migrations, you know, kind of the same thing for moving just storage on the vSphere side. Enhanced session mode, you know, very similar to some of the advanced console features in vSphere. That's what enhanced session mode is here. Replication, Hyper-V includes replication as part of the platform. So you can actually replicate VMs to another Hyper-V host somewhere to kind of act as a DR type of solution if need be. And the rest are just things that have to do with, you know, how virtual machines behave when you're connecting to them through this platform. The other really important thing in here is Virtual Switch Manager. So, you know, it's kind of the same thing as vSphere, creating vSwitches. You come in here to do that. I have a single vSwitch defined. When you create a new one, you'll have 3 different options. An external vSwitch is obviously exactly how it sounds. It connects you to the external world, and it associates a physical NIC on the host with that vSwitch, just like in vSphere. Internal allows communication between the virtual machines that are part of that switch and the host. Private is exactly the same as internal, with the exception that the host is not included in that communication. So a couple of different options there. In the sake of time, I'm kind of scooting through here, but really, I mean, this is, you know, that's kind of the gist of it. I mean, you can manage your virtual machines just like your virtual machines in vSphere. You right-click, you say Settings, and it will actually bring up the settings dialog for that virtual machine. Running a lot of this stuff, a lot of these hosts as nested hypervisors on top of my laptop. So they are not the speediest thing right now because of that, especially being as I got the webcam going. My CPU on my laptop is just chugging right now. But you can see that you've got a lot of the same hardware-related settings as you do inside of vSphere. You know, I can configure memory, CPUs, you know, connected hard drives. You know, I configure checkpoints. So checkpoints in Hyper-V are the same as snapshots in VMware, just different terminology, similar behavior, and all of your different VM-associated items are contained in this view here. Now, this is the tool for, like I said, standalone Hyper-V hosts, or maybe when you have just a couple of hosts that you want to manage. Failover Cluster Manager is the tool that you want to use when you are managing multiple Hyper-V hosts that are part of a cluster. So you can see I've got a cluster up here called Ando MB HV cluster, and this is the domain that it's associated with. Roles, I can see the different virtual machines that are contained in this cluster. I have just 2 virtual machines inside of this cluster right now. And nodes, this is where I can go to view the physical nodes of the workstation, the physical nodes of the cluster. I'm actually going to kill my webcam for a second. That way I get a little bit more speed here. That should free us up. There we go. Okay, so I can see the different nodes that I've got as part of this cluster. So I can see HV1, HV2, you know, how many votes do they have in the cluster? So very similar to the vSphere side as far as determining whether the cluster is up or not. In the case of an even number of nodes in the cluster, you have to configure what's called a disk quorum or a file share quorum. It's basically just the same idea where in vSphere it chooses a data store to use as another vote essentially to determine whether the cluster is up and running. And you can do that in the failover cluster manager here by right-clicking, more actions, and configure cluster quorum settings. Now, again, I mentioned that you can use a small LUN if you're using like a traditional SAN to present storage into your Hyper-V host. You can choose a small LUN. You can use a file share on an SMB3 file server, or Microsoft now has the option of using an Azure Cloud Witness as a vote here as well. So a couple of different options for doing that. And I mean, managing the virtual machines from this view are very much the same as managing them from Hyper-V Manager. You know, I can right-click if I want to, and I can get to all the different stuff that we saw on Hyper-V Manager. You know, I've got a couple of different options over here. You know, startup priority if I want a certain virtual machine to start up first. I can configure replication just like I did in Hyper-V Manager, and a lot of the stuff that you're used to seeing. When you want to actually create another virtual machine, you can do that from the Virtual Machines tab here. And then the other thing that I always like to point out here, HA in vSphere is per cluster, right? You enable HA on the cluster, and every virtual machine is instantly enabled for HA. That's where it differentiates with Hyper-V here. Hyper-V allows you to granularly choose which VMs are HA enabled. Now you can kind of do that in the vSphere side as well, but in Hyper-V it's done that way by default. You have to actually configure, if you've created your virtual machines in Hyper-V Manager and you later want them to be HA enabled, you actually have to come into Failover Cluster Manager here, say configure role, and then you would select type virtual machine, select the VM, work through the wizard, and it would enable it for HA. That kind of throws some people off. If you're using a cluster, if you've got a Hyper-V cluster and you want to create some new virtual machines, come in here to Failover Cluster Manager and create it. Because when you create a virtual machine inside of Failover Cluster Manager, it will automatically enable it for HA. So I always like to mention that to people when they are creating VMs, because what happens is they create it in Hyper-V Manager, and you know they think it's HA enabled. 3 months goes by, they lose a host in the cluster, and why didn't that mission critical SQL server stay online? Or you know, fail over automatically, and that's often a common reason. A couple other things to mention in here. I always like to come up here to the cluster properties. And this is a new feature that they've added in Windows Server 2016, this balancer tab. So for those of you that are used to vSphere DRS, this is the Hyper-V equivalent of DRS. So it doesn't require SCVMM. You get it with just Failover Cluster Manager. You enable this automatic load balancing, and you set the aggressiveness down here. And when it load balances, either always or when a node joins a cluster, or a couple of different options there. So that's the Hyper-V equivalent of DRS without SCVMM. The other point the thing I wanted to point out here is networks. So we talked about live migration, again, aka vMotion earlier. You can configure the way that live migration behaves right from this view inside of Cluster Manager as well. So I got this cluster, I come up here to live migration settings, and you can choose which cluster network you want to use for live migration. So a lot of people like to have a couple of dedicated links on each host, specifically for live migration or vMotion. If you have a number of different physical NICs attached to your Hyper-V host, I only have one in this lab for lab purposes, but you'd see a number of different cluster networks here depending on different IP addresses, different subnets, et cetera, and you could configure how all those behave here. And then finally, for the sake of time, I'm not going to cover SCVMM just because that is probably a whole webinar in and of itself, and again, it's more geared towards enterprises. The other thing I wanted to mention here real quick is PowerShell. So I mentioned PowerShell is the other management option for Hyper-V. You know, you've got a number of different commands. So if I just run a get command dash module and I return all the stuff from the Hyper-V module, I just get a ton of different stuff. And again, anything that you can do in the GUI in Hyper-V, you can do in PowerShell and then some. You'll find not only some Hyper-V related stuff in the Hyper-V module, but you'll also find a bunch of stuff in the failover cluster module, because again, Microsoft is using failover clustering to actually facilitate that kind of HA functionality. Additionally, you know, if you want to actually manage VMs, you can. So if I just use PowerShell remoting to remote into Hyper-V host 2, I can actually do things like get VM. Tell me which VMs are running on the machine. So if I run get VM, it'll return a list of all the running VMs, so I can see I've got my 2 virtual machines, what their CPU usage looks like, you know, what the memory assigned is, their uptime, just some basic statistics. That's just an example of how you can use Hyper-V to actually manage some of those machines. So, all right, so let's switch back to the slide deck here. Again, that was kind of a crash course in Hyper-V architecture, and we touched a little bit on management. But we're also want to talk about some of the tools that you can use to actually get your virtual machines over to Hyper-V. And this is the part of the conversation where things start to get they start to get a little interesting. The migration story around Hyper-V has changed a lot over the last couple of years. And with that, the types of tools that are being used, where you use them, it's changed a lot over the last couple of years. And you'll kind of see as we start stepping through the various tools, I'll kind of explain why and how. This is another area where I feel like VMware kind of has a one-up on Hyper-V, because you've got your vSphere converter, and that's pretty much your tool that does it all, right? Microsoft has a number of different tools available, and again, like I said, have changed the story a lot over the last couple of years. So the first one I wanted to talk about is disk to VHD. So this tool is actually a sysinternals tool written by Mark Rusinovich, who works for Microsoft. It's a great tool. I mean, it's kind of your Ford truck version of a P2V utility or a V2V utility, however you want to use it. It's reliable. It works very well. It's free to download and use. You know, it's kind of a basic low-end utility for converting a running system to a VHD or a VHDX. So essentially what you do is you run it on the system that you want to convert. It'll use volume shadow copy inside of that machine. It'll create a VHDX wherever you tell it to put it. You take that VHDX, you move it over into your hypervisor storage, you create a new VM, and instead of creating a new virtual disk as part of that VM, you attach the VHDX that you created as using this part of using this utility. There are some very basic CLI type of functions for this tool, so you can do some basic scripting functionality. But again, it's kind of very basic, kind of a manual, get the job done type of tool. The next thing that we have is Microsoft Virtual Machine Converter. And this tool, it has something of an interesting history. You know, it really had a lot of potential. And I say had because the tool is officially deprecated. It's still available until about mid-June, so next month. And if you really read the press notice about it being deprecated, they are going to actually remove the download. So if you want to use this tool, I suggest you go grab it. I've got the bit.ly link for it right there underneath the picture on the left-hand side of the slide. You know, it supports vCenter 4.1, 5.1, 5.5 as the source. Personally, I've never tried it myself with anything newer than 5.5, but I've heard rumors that it works. But again, I can't say that myself with any certainty. It supports hardware versions 4, 7, 8, 9, and 10. The destination can be a Hyper-V 2008 R2 or 2012 R2, or this tool can even go to an Azure VHD as well if you'd like it to. You got a number of different supported guest operating systems. Online conversions require that the firewall be disabled, RDP is enabled, and the proper permissions are set on all the storage locations where you're actually sending the virtual machine. For Linux conversions, SSH has to be installed, and the root credentials have to be enabled. Sudo is not supported. So if you run a distribution of Linux like Ubuntu that uses sudo by default, you have to make sure you run passwd on your root account to set up a password for your root account and actually use that when you do the conversion. The next thing is the MAT is what it's called for short, but the Migration Automation Toolkit. Again, had potential, but it's now deprecated. Really, this was an add-on for MVMC. And really, it was just a collection of automation scripts for MVMC. There's a number of scripts. It was backed by SQL Express, and you could run mass conversion jobs, large numbers of VMs all at once. Say maybe you had 200, 300, 400 VMs that needed to be migrated. This tool has the capabilities of doing that. And it's scalable if you wanted to install the tool on multiple machines, worker machines. To actually do the conversions, you could install it in several locations. And it required that PowerCLI be available as well. If you're interested in that tool, I've got the bit.ly link for it right there as well. Again, deprecated, but it still works today for the most part. Now, here's another area where things get interesting. So we talk about the deprecation of MVMC and the Migration Automation Toolkit. And where my mind automatically goes is, okay, well, they're deprecating this tool that we've used for, however long. What's it being replaced by? And the official word from Microsoft is that Azure Site Recovery is going to be the tool that is being used going forward for doing conversions. Now, it's a good tool. It works for what it's intended for, which is vaulting workloads into Azure to act as a DR target, basically. And by proxy, it kind of acts as a conversion tool for Hyper-V, but there are a number of different caveats. If I'm going from VMware to Hyper-V on-premise, first thing I have to do is I have to set up Azure Site Recovery, which the hardware requirements are just massive. So you see here the third bullet point on the slide. I need a dedicated server on-site with 16 gigs of memory, 8 CPU cores, 1.2 terabytes, yes, terabytes of storage. Now, those are all recommendations. When I set this up last, I actually shorted some of those requirements a little bit, and the installer yells at you all along the way, but it lets you move forward. But those are the official software requirements from Microsoft. Excuse me. So, a lot of businesses, small businesses, a lot of people don't have that type of hardware lying around to be able to do that. So, really, those hardware requirements are kind of astronomical if you think about it. The other problem with this is, in order to actually do that conversion, I have to let Azure Site Recovery sync that machine into Azure. And then what I need to do from there, I need to then download the VHD and create my VM on site. So you think about that, I'm sending that payload across the WAN twice in order to facilitate that conversion. So that's kind of a problem. The other thing that Azure Site Recovery can do is if you've got two VMware sites, you can have it act as the orchestration for syncing between the two sites, but that doesn't help you in going from VMware to Hyper-V on-premise. So it's kind of an interesting tool. I'd like to see how they improve it moving forward. If you want more information about it, I've got the URL there at the bottom right. And I'm sure there's some stuff on uservoice.microsoft.com where you can actually go in and you can vote for additional functionality. They say this is going to be the tool moving forward, but I haven't seen them make any major improvements for Hyper-V migrations in the recent past. So this will just be one that we need to keep our eyes out on, and hopefully they add that functionality for us. going forward. One other thing I want to mention here, a lot of people have concerns that, well, if I'm vaulting a machine into Azure, aren't there some costs associated with that? Well, Microsoft says when you use this service, the first 31 days, there's no cost for using ASR. So as long as you complete your migration in the first 31 days and you've pulled everything out of Azure, there's no additional cost, basically. So, I mean, you look at those tools and, you know, as far as official tools go, they're not any one of them is like a fully functional P2V or V2V migration tool. Yes, disk to VHD, I use it all the time. It's a great tool, but you know, sometimes when I want to do a lot of conversion jobs, it just gets a little bit tedious. There are some alternatives. SCVMM, it has native P2V capabilities or V2V capabilities built right into it. Now, I say that with an asterisk, if I could put an asterisk on my words. That is something that has changed a couple of times in the past. So it used to be in SCVMM, and then they took it out for a while, and now they've added it back. So, you know, even that migration capabilities inside of Virtual Machine Manager have been questionable over the last couple of years. So that leaves us with, you know, third-party conversion utilities, or what Microsoft says, you know, they're Microsoft software partners. There's a lot of companies out there that make, you know, little, you know, P2V fee per virtual machine that you want to migrate. And those are usually great options. But again, it is an added cost, so that's something that you have to take into account. And then the other thing that I like to point out, you know, if the workload is easily movable, consider just migrating the workload. So instead of actually moving the VM, build a new VM and migrate the payload inside of it. I see a lot of people try to P2V or V2V domain controllers, and I think, you know, AD is something that's very easily movable. Why not just, you know, build some new DCs, move your FSMO roles, and away you go. So if it's something like that, that's definitely something that you might want to consider. So that kind of wraps up our content. I want to talk about our product, Altaro VM Backup version 7 real quick. Actually 7.1 now. But again, you know, we focus on a number of different things with our product. We focus on efficient backup setup. We want you to get up and running quickly. We want the interface to be easy to use, but with that ease of use, we really focus on giving you full control of your backups as well. So we provide all the powerful capabilities that you're used to seeing in a backup application, deduplication, encryption, compression, those types of things. The other thing that we really focus on is a very positive support experience. We don't do tiered support at Altaro. You're not going to get the whole have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again type of thing when you call support. You're going to get a product expert that owns your issue from A to B. The other thing that I want to mention is our product now supports vSphere 6.5 with our 7.1 update. So if you've got 7.5 and you need, if you're got 6.5 and you know, you're interested in our product, we now support that version as well. One thing that I also want to mention is we've got a new deduplication technology baked into our version 7 of our application. It's some of the best deduplication on the market. Our devs really did a fantastic job with it. It's lowered storage requirements significantly, allows you to perform much faster backups. It's fully inline, so only the blocks that absolutely need to go across the wire go across the wire. When we compared our deduplication to some of our competitors over there on the right, we've come in at much lower than some of our competitors, so we've been pretty happy with the performance thus far. And then, you know, if you're kind of curious of what our UI looks like I said, we really focus on ease of use. We really try to keep a nice, clean, easy to figure out UI, and this is a kind of a picture of the dashboard here. If you're interested in more information about our product, go to altaro.com/vm-backup, or if you want to download a 30-day full-feature trial or a free version that's free for 2 VMs forever, you can go to altaro.com/download. Now, we've got a little time for some Q&A. So again, a quick mention on the Q&A. I hope you guys have been putting your questions in as they've been coming up, but if you haven't, you have a question, feel free to put it in the questions form in GoToMeeting. And again, if we don't get to all the questions during the Q&A today, I always do a follow-up post for my webinars out on our Altaro blog. So in this case, altaro.com/VMware. Keep an eye on that blog. In the coming weeks, we'll have a copy of the webinar, copy of the slide deck, any supporting materials, and a full list of all the questions and all their associated answers, even the ones that don't get answered live today. If you want to sign up for some reminders, if you want to get a notification when that post is live, you can go to altaro.com/VMware/sign up, and you can sign up to receive notifications for when that post is live. So with that said, let me get the questions form out here. And again, if you have questions, keep them coming. Keep them coming. Have them come right through the questions form, and I will see what I can do here. So, first question: does vSphere and Hyper-V support GPU-intensive VMs? Yeah, both hypervisors have the capabilities of utilizing a GPU inside of the host. So both of them support that option if that's something you're looking for. Where that really comes into play most often is VDI scenarios. So in the case where you want to actually host up some desktops for your users. On the VMware side, that's VMware Horizon View is their solution. On the Hyper-V side, it kind of piggybacks on top of RDS and ties into Hyper-V as well to utilize those, to create and utilize those virtual desktops. Let's see, another question here. Azure Site Recovery, do we have to pay for the process server in Azure? That's a good question. I was actually looking at that yesterday in preparation of this webinar because I actually had that question myself. I couldn't find any clarifying documentation that actually said the process server requires a fee, because all their documentation says for the first 31 days it is actually free to use Azure Site Recovery. So what I would do to get a little bit of clarification on that is I would talk to your Microsoft rep to get a little bit more information on that particular piece of it, because like I said, their documentation just is not clear on that, sadly. Oh, let's see here. Okay, looking through the questions again. All right. So if I want to try out Windows Server 2016 Hyper-V, what do I need to think about regarding licenses? So that's a good question. So Microsoft provides trial licensing to all of their downloads. What you can do is you can go out to the Microsoft Evaluation Center. I don't know the URL off the top of my head. If you just do a quick search for Microsoft Evaluation Center, you can actually go out, download an evaluation copy of Windows Server 2016, and the license is good for, I want to say 180 days. It's 180 days or 120. I don't remember which one. It's a good length of time, enough time for you to really test it out and give it a good go. Let's see. I've got an Altaro related question here. Can we install Altaro on a Windows Server 2016 Core installation? Yeah, you can install our product on top of Windows Server Core. Absolutely. That's actually how I run it inside of my lab. I've got a 2012 R2 Core server that runs our software. So yeah, definitely. Let's see. Again, keep your questions coming. I've got a couple of more here I can go through. Let's see. Does Hyper-V use the equivalent of EVC? So yes, there is an option in Hyper-V for EVC. When you've got different hosts with different hypervisor types. The big difference is instead of it being kind of a cluster-wide thing, again, kind of the same thing as the HA settings. It's on a per VM setting. So what you have to do is you go into the virtual machine settings, and under the processor, there's a checkbox for CPU compatibility. You just check that checkbox, and that VM is good to go for jumping between hosts with different CPU types. Again, kind of the same. You got the same considerations you have to take with VMware. It's not going to work when you jump between different brands, so you can't go from like Intel to AMD, but different versions of Intel CPUs or different versions of AMD CPUs. That compatibility checkbox in the VM settings takes care of that. Well, let's see. I think that about wraps it up for us. Let me see here. I think we've got time for one more. Let me keep looking through the list here. Let me expand my form, make it a little easier to look through. There we go. Let's see. Looks like another question about our product. Can VMware backup be recovered to a Hyper-V host and vice versa? And currently, no, we cannot do cross-hypervisor restores with our product. It's if you're running a VM on a Hyper-V host, it has to be restored to a Hyper-V host. It could be any Hyper-V host, or VMware host has to go to any VMware host. So, yep. Is this session being recorded? Yes, we did record today's session. We are keeping a copy of the questions. And again, be sure to keep an eye out for the Q&A post that will be coming up in the next week or two on altaro.com/VMware. And again, I'll make sure that the slide deck is part of that post as well. So with that in mind, again, any questions I didn't have time for today, I'll go ahead and make sure that we get them covered inside of the Q&A section of the follow-up post. And other than that, I will let everybody get back to their day. And thanks for joining the webinar today. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.